But we are going to turn to these three topics. We had originally thought we would do some breakout sessions and make this super dynamic, but it turns out that Tim and I thought it might be easier to bring everyone along so we can cover these three important topics, but we're injecting polls along the way to get your feedback and then also to generate some discussion. So we're hoping now, this is meant to be a workshop. So really important and strongly encourage everyone to use the chat box, raise your hand to speak. This is a lot of new material. And as Joe Palladino said earlier, we're entering just this very more complex industry in trying to provide these BCA frameworks that can allow you all to make decisions about what to include, what not to include, how to include it. Tim and I certainly don't have it figured out, and the NSPM for DRs is kind of a first step to look at what's happening around the country and take that and put it into a cohesive guidance documents, but we don't have it all figured out. And your input today will be really important to help raise any issues, questions that we haven't thought about and that we need to really think about the application of some of these concepts. We're going to talk first. This will probably be our shortest deep dive session, but we're going to just review with you and then in a couple slides ask you some questions and have you give some feedback on a little exercise we have. So to begin, I think, again, importance of walking you through this multi-step process for defining your jurisdiction's primary test. A few things to keep in mind. Our experience to date in where states have been using the NSPM is not necessarily, of course, that they're starting from scratch and building a new test. In many cases, they're looking at their existing test and they're testing to see how it aligns with the NSPM principles and making modifications based on that process. So this is intended here in the NSPM for all jurisdictions to consider how you go about walking through a process, and best if it involves a stakeholder process. We've seen this happen in the context of formal proceedings or in the context of a technical workshop. We often go to present to a commission first. Commission invites us, or in some case with another state agency, to learn about the NSPM. There then is sometimes a broader workshop or stakeholder group review, and then some decision, formal or not, to actually take the NSPM and do a review of current practice. So it's really up to a jurisdiction. And you'll see here in these different 5 steps, again, many of the principles are essentially incorporated in here. And this can help guide you in a stakeholder process to say, all right, we did step 1, we articulated our policy goals. And in articulating those policy goals, it helped us, make clear what are the different, from there, what are the different impacts that we need to be accounted for. And then a step 2 process where you can use the NSPM to look at the whole range of utility system impacts and make sure that full universe is reviewed and confirm which impacts are included, where most are relevant, although some may depend on a particular DER. Again, may not be specific for a certain type of a DER, but it may be for others. Then a step 3 is to say, okay, now that we have the utility system impacts identified, what is the universe of non-utility system impacts that we should be including? And again, this very importantly ties to that inventory of those policies that your jurisdiction has taken. Now, very importantly here is this departure from saying, well, you know, depending on what traditional test I'm using, of course, host customer impacts are included, but it may not be the case. It may be that as a jurisdiction, you may determine that, you know, we're including utility system impacts, we're including certain societal impacts because they're identified in applicable policies, but host customer impacts are in some cases difficult to quantify, and they're not required to be included, and therefore by policy identified as such, and therefore we want to, you know, we don't necessarily feel we need to include the full universe of host customer impacts, or none at all. And we actually have recently seen the state of New Hampshire take that approach. And then in step 4, ensuring that benefits and costs are properly addressed. Again, this is where looking at principles of symmetry, are impacts sufficiently material where they would have a significant impact on the BC ratio outcome, ensuring there is not double counting, and then of course the consistency and treatment of DERs. And then lastly, comprehensive documentation. So this really is just meant to help a jurisdiction with its process to say, okay, we've done this step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we have seen Connecticut use this approach. The state of Washington has used this approach. In other cases we've seen in Arkansas, we saw the jurisdiction actually rather go through every principles. They took one principle at a time and then reviewed how their current practice aligns with or doesn't align with those principles. So then this first kind of 3 steps I've compiled here together, and it starts with this articulating your policy goals. Now, we spoke a bit earlier about there being these common overarching goals that are very typical. This is all very familiar language to utility regulators in terms of the fundamental overarching goal of ensuring safe, reliable services, you know, equitable economic returns for utilities, promoting customer equity, and protecting, reducing energy burden for low-income customers. Then there are these resource goals, okay, and these are often embedded in integrated resource planning documents, other planning documents, and refer specifically to the electricity resource. And by the way, the NSPM applies broadly to natural gas and other fuels as well. And then lastly is this bucket of other applicable goals. And these are things that may go beyond the 2 categories above, but that may be articulated very clearly in legislation, in statute, and so forth. And I think this is where this question that came up about, you know, I think it's very clear, and a challenge is that in many states there might be a disconnect between what's articulated in statute or existing decisions, and some of them may be quite old, but still relevant, and what the current cost effectiveness testing practice is. And I think that it's fascinating to see the states that have used the NSPM to date. The commission staff, their first step is they come up with, we've seen 10 to 17 to over 20 pages of the long list of articulated policies and decisions, and then first putting them on paper, and then going through and determining, okay, which of these here are relevant to what are the different impacts that we should be looking at. And in some cases, it's tricky because in some cases there is, you know, it becomes challenging when a particular statute dictates very specifically a level of investment in a particular DR, so many megawatts. And that really can, of course, create the situation where you say, where, you know, that is by default cost effective because it's a requirement. And everything else has to incorporate that. So it's going to vary by jurisdiction to jurisdiction, what those goals look like, and then what those boundaries are around as to who's impacted by those goals and what to account for. Okay, so we have a little exercise here. I hope you can all see my screen. And this is just a very simplified version of a table that shows the 3 examples of what are the applicable policies in a hypothetical jurisdiction. All right. And it further makes some assumptions about what are the goals reflected in those policies. And in these policies, you know, whether there's specific DERs that are identified in these policies. And given that a huge, you know, the premise for the NSPM for DERs is to ensure that there is consistency, that there is a primary test, a consistent test that's used across DERs. How do you as a regulator or as a planner look at these applicable policy goals and say, well, this is kind of a mixed bag here. And how do I take this information and create a primary test? So I have a bit of I have to change this because I was not clever enough to do an animation, so I have to do it this way. And I'm going to go back to a slideshow mode, because in the bottom half of this, here's our question to you. And we'd like everyone to take a little time to look at this. And I'm going to really invite Tim to chime in to make sure I've explained this as clearly as I can. But essentially, there are choices to be made here. This is the art versus the science. And in a perfect world, all regulations and statutes would consistently treat DERs, but in identifying them and in identifying different goals, but that's not the case. And so as a jurisdiction, if you're grappling with a simple situation like this, what are your choices for how you account for these impacts? The other fuels, the greenhouse gas emission reductions, the creation of jobs, and protecting low-income customers. So one option is to adopt a broad interpretation of the policy goals, where, well, if it applies to one policy, it's going to apply to all of them and all the DRs, so I'm going to just account for all these impacts. The second would be the narrowest interpretation of those goals. And the third would be, well, something in between. And this is where we just selected an example of saying, well, of course, we're going to protect low-income customers across the board, even though it's not articulated clearly in a particular, you know, policy. So giving everyone a few seconds to look at this and sort of digest what I just presented, we want to issue a poll and ask you to select whether you would select option 1, 2, or 3. Now, before we do this, are there any questions? Does this all make sense to everybody before we open up the poll? We're good? Okay, why don't we issue the poll and let's see what people have to, what everyone has to say. Okay, why don't we see what those results are, and then we'd like to open it up for a bit of discussion. All right, so I think everyone can see these results. Nearly a third chose the first option, about 20% the second, and the third said determined somewhere in between. Now, I would love to hear from folks about questions about what was your thought process in determining, in leading to your answer. Any thoughts? Anybody want to speak up or chat about, add your thoughts in the chat box?
I was trying to decide what the impacts would be for choosing the broadest interpretation or the narrowest interpretation of policies.
I'll just add, this is Tim, that we're going to be talking a little bit more about that very issue and then another deep dive. And so it's a great question. We're trying to get a sense, because oftentimes this issue has to be resolved before the BCA is done. And so it's usually best, ideally, to make the call before you see the results. But I understand everybody wants to see what the implications are. And again, we'll talk about that later.
Julie, there's a comment in the chat box.
Yes, I'm seeing Joe says that we need to consider options and trade-offs. Therefore, option one, but I may not understand the primary test. I think that the trade-offs, and I think unpacking and looking at through a stakeholder process of what the trade-offs would be if one went with the broadest versus narrowest, as Rochelle just indicated. How do you know what that trade-off is? And I think, again, that goes to Tim's point about how do you gather more information. And the other thing that's very important, I will note, and Washington State is a great example of this, is they started going down the NSPM process a couple years ago, 2017, and they did a whole inventory, and this was associated with efficiency. They did a whole inventory of their policies, and this was led by UTC staff. And then the Clean Energy Transformation Act was passed in the process of this. And they basically put the brakes on their review of their cost effectiveness test, because then suddenly they have this new, very comprehensive act that identified a whole lot of different goals. And now they've gone back and they're planning next year to go back and review their tests now with this new set of this new comprehensive statute. And the point being that the challenge is that regulations and laws and statutes aren't static, they are dynamic. And that adds a whole other level of complexity to this process. But it is important to recognize that, anticipation and the timing of updating or implementing a cost effectiveness test vis-a-vis what's on the books. And further, another thing I will raise too, because I think this came up in Washington as well, was utility regulators will need to address issues in some cases regarding their legal authority with some of the identified statutes or whatnot that may be looked at because that has come up as well in terms of ensuring that the commission is in a position to identify the different policies and the implementation of them through the different investments and decisions. Any other thoughts or questions on this? Does this concept make sense?
Yep, Julie, and we've just had some minor chats about some of the state's considerations for what they are required to include. So thank you for contributing there. One state, New Jersey, all decisions consider job creation and equity in low-income customers. So thank you, Commissioner, for contributing that. And thanks, Danielle, for your key consideration. And
Can I respond
Please
to one question? I see that Danielle says, what are the detriments, downsides to being more inclusive versus excluding potentially relevant goals? So that's a good question. And again, it speaks to, Tim, let's take the example of, you know, including or not including greenhouse gas emission goals.
Yeah, we'll talk about that again in a little while, but the bottom line is, if you include those goals, you might end up adopting more DERs, which might cost more money and which might have more rate impacts. So it's that trade-off that needs to be accounted for. Of course, as we'll say, it's important to estimate what those trade-offs are in terms of rate impacts and costs, but that's often the trade-off.
And then we just had another comment that even if you did use the narrowest interpretation as the primary, it would not preclude you looking at those other areas. I think that was maybe mentioned before. So any other comments?
Okay, let's move on. So just going to step 4, the issue of symmetry. This is another example I'm going to provide. And of course, it's essentially it is a math issue. And it's one, you know, any economist would argue that, yes, of course you would treat costs and benefits symmetrically. Otherwise, you could lead to a bias in either direction and over or under investing in a particular resource. And yet, this presents itself as a challenge in accounting for impacts for different DER resources. And I think the very simple example provided here, and we were going to actually, I started going down the road of creating a little math exercise for everyone to do, and Tim advised me that it might get a little complicated and messy. So we thought we would just present to you here a very basic example. And again, you have on the left, you start off with your DER costs and what those costs are. In the case of host customer costs included, benefits excluded in the first example. And then the symmetrical example, you either have both cost benefits included or both of them excluded. And what you find is in the asymmetrical example, you of course can see by not including the host customer non-energy benefits, you have a negative net benefit and you have a benefit cost ratio of less than 1. Whereas in the symmetrical examples where you've included both or excluded both, your net benefits differ, but your ratios are still over 1.0, which is obviously this is all part of the assumed numbers, assumptions, but what it's illustrating is that by excluding the host customer non-energy benefits, which we all know is often a big challenge for many jurisdictions in their TRC or other cost effectiveness tests used, especially for efficiency, it's increasingly going to become an issue in the case of DRs more broadly. So again, this is a very simplified example, but can't stress enough the importance of ensuring symmetry. And the point being that if you're not going to include or identify or willing to study the benefits, then just don't include the costs. That is something that we hope the NSPM can help guide jurisdictions to address. So any questions or Tim, any additional comments on the symmetry principle?
Not for me.
Any questions? Okay, I am going to be the, oops, I didn't mean to stop sharing, but in the interest of encouraging engagement, can I please invite an emoji for this illustrative example? Let me look at those emojis again because I'm not totally familiar with them all. Put anyone in that you like. It can be a thumbs up. I don't think there's a thumbs down option, is there? Okay, only a few of you. Oh, I saw a party hat there. That's great. Any way you want to express yourself, we just want to make sure that people are fully understanding, the importance of this. Okay, so moving along here, we're going to now just stop. That was sort of just the overview of developing your primary test, emphasizing some key components of it and considerations. And now I'd like to invite everyone to enter in the chat box, what was just one thing that you took away from this last brief discussion? And it could be a question if you felt like there was something, but we really invite everyone to go to their chat box and enter a key takeaway. All right, Danielle, good point. Danielle offers the decision to what goals to incorporate in a test isn't as straightforward as I'd assumed. And the importance of addressing policies. Any other quick thoughts from people? There are some good questions in here. How to address social cost of carbon or avoided greenhouse gas reductions. And there's another question about, are there more states using asymmetrical or symmetrical tests? And I think that the answer to that is probably more in the asymmetrical category, especially when it comes to treatment of host customer impacts. And Tim, I don't know if you're looking at the chat box, but maybe there's a few here that we could, any questions, NSP overlays.
So I can comments if this is the time.
Yeah.
So on the cost of assembling the information, that's an issue that always comes up. And in my view, the cost of assembling a lot of this information is usually a very small portion of the kind of costs and benefits that are at stake. And so I don't see that it should not be a barrier. Of course, there are some things you don't want to spend days and days and dollars to cover. I think there's just a balance that can be made there by identifying which impacts are going to really have the biggest effect and make sure you get those right. And that kind of spills over into the other question about social cost of carbon and greenhouse gases. We didn't in the manual talk a whole lot about what is the best input to use for these impacts, because that's its own report, and many reports, in fact. So I'm not going to really say much there, except that, in terms of how you come up with your numbers for environmental externalities, there's a whole variety one could use. I've got my opinions, but I think it's safe to say that there's several out there, and that in a way that's something that stakeholders can advocate for and discuss, and you know, eventually the commissioners need to kind of resolve what's the best source of data for some of these. Oh, symmetrical with regard to jobs creation, that's an easy one. That just means that whenever you look at increased jobs as a result of a DER, you need to also look at jobs that are lost by avoiding certain power system investments. So that's fundamentally a critical principle, and sometimes it's not adhered to, but it's important. It's another good example of asymmetry. Question about whether the NSPM overlays what it already has in place. That's not how we're seeing it. We're seeing this whole approach to coming up with a primary test is a way to modify, replace, update the current practice. And some states, most states have some practice for energy efficiency, but some might not have them for, say, distributed generation or electrification. And so this is a way to, again, update your test so that it can be applied, A, across all DERs consistently, and B, it can account for the most recent policy goals.
Okay, so thanks for all these great questions. Chris made a comment about AMI filings having no cost or benefit numbers, only costs and examples of asymmetry. So I think we do see many examples out there, and as Tim just said, we see many cases of where within a particular jurisdiction, the way that a value of solar studies being analyzed is very different of the way other values of DRs may be being analyzed. And so this framework attempts to bring them all under the same umbrella. So with that, we're going to move on